What would drive a man to invade the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, risking millions of lives, all while underestimating the very leader he sought to destroy? How can fear, hatred, and obsession dictate the fate of entire nations? Why did one of history's most meticulous military strategists, Adolf Hitler, repeatedly ignore warnings, miscalculate logistics, and falter against an opponent many considered weaker? And how did Joseph Stalin, a man as ruthless as he was paranoid, turn these miscalculations into a strategic advantage that would forever alter the course of the Second World War? Hitler versus Stalin. The names alone summon images of tyranny, bloodshed, and an ideological struggle that consumed Europe. Yet the true story is not merely one of soldiers and artillery, but of the inner workings of two minds, clashing with consequences that would stretch far beyond the battlefield. One man, Hitler, consumed by ideology and paranoia, obsessed with racial purity and the annihilation of communism. The other, Stalin, hardened by purges, revolutions, and the constant threat of betrayal, guided by ruthless pragmatism and a terrifying patience. It was not geography alone, nor the vast armies of Germany and the Soviet Union that defined the Eastern Front. It was the collision of these psyches. Hitler's fear of Stalin, of the Red Army, and of the very ideology that opposed him drove decisions that often defied logic and military prudence. Stalin, understanding the vulnerabilities of both his nation and his enemy, turned this fear into opportunity, manipulating perception and morale to fortify the Soviet war effort. By 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the world would witness the largest invasion in human history. Millions of German soldiers marched east, confident in the invincibility of the Third Reich, yet unaware that their own leader's obsession would become their undoing. Hitler's hatred of communism and paranoia about Stalin's intentions blinded him to the scale of Russia, the harshness of its winters, and the capacity of its people to endure unimaginable suffering. Every city occupied, every village razed, and every battle fought bore the imprint of a psychological struggle far more dangerous than any battlefield tactic: the struggle between fear and resolve, between obsession and patience. Stalin, for his part, had cultivated an environment where fear could be weaponized. He understood that the psychological dimension of war was as decisive as tanks or aircraft. The Soviet leaders' meticulous planning, the relocation of entire industries east of the Ural Mountains, the evacuation of civilians, and the strategic scorched earth policy all reflected a mind attuned to turning enemy hubris into advantage. The Red Army, often underestimated by German intelligence, became the instrument through which Stalin's patience would punish Hitler's paranoia. Yet this was not a story of abstract strategy. It is a story of people, the soldiers who marched under the shadow of frostbite and starvation, the civilians trapped in besieged cities, and the officers who dared to challenge or counsel their leaders. Hitler's relentless drive to crush the Soviet Union, to impose his ideological vision, led to staggering human losses, mistakes that compounded with every decision fueled by fear and hatred. Stalin's ability to absorb these blows, endure the sacrifices demanded of his people, and strike decisively when opportunity arose, revealed a form of psychological warfare rarely matched in history. What made the clash between Hitler and Stalin unique was the intertwining of ideology, psychology, and strategy. Hitler's decisions were colored by a vision of destiny, a belief in the invincibility of the Aryan race, and an obsession with eradicating Bolshevism. Stalin's decisions, in contrast, were shaped by decades of survival, paranoia about betrayal, and an understanding that time and attrition could be as deadly as any army. In many ways, the Eastern Front was a battle of minds as much as it was a battle of guns, a war where obsession met endurance, where hatred met calculated patience. As Hitler pushed deeper into Soviet territory, cities burned under the advancing Wehrmacht, and millions of lives hung in the balance. The psychological duel between these men dictated outcomes more than numbers or weapons ever could. Hitler's overconfidence and ideological rigidity would lead him to underestimate supply lines, winter, and the morale of Soviet troops. Stalin's understanding of human resilience, combined with his willingness to exploit his enemy's fear, allowed the Soviet Union to transform catastrophic losses into lessons and lessons into victories. The story of Hitler versus Stalin, therefore, is more than a chronicle of World War II. It is a study of the human mind under the strain of power, fear, and ambition. It is a reminder that the greatest battles are not always fought with rifles and tanks, but with perception, psychology, and the will to endure. Hitler's obsession with Stalin and the Soviet Union became a weapon that destroyed him. Stalin's mastery of patience and resilience turned what could have been a disaster into a triumph. And so, the Eastern Front was not merely a battlefield of soldiers. It was a theater of human emotion, a stage where paranoia, hatred, and calculated patience intersected to shape the fate of millions. Every strategic misstep, every moment of hubris, every decision influenced by fear, contributed to a story that continues to captivate historians, military strategists, and anyone seeking to understand the terrifying power of human ambition. By asking these questions, what drove Hitler, what made Stalin resilient, and why fear and hatred can shape the course of history, we begin to uncover the true story behind Hitler versus Stalin, a narrative that is as psychological as it is historical, as human as it is epic. This is a story of obsession and endurance, of fear and strategy, of two men whose choices would define not only a war, but the destiny of the modern world. If Hitler's obsession with the East was a force of recklessness, Stalin's approach to the looming confrontation was one of calculation and forbearing patience. By 1939, Europe was already teetering on the edge of total war. Germany had remilitarized the Rhineland, absorbed Austria, and subjugated Czechoslovakia. Hitler's expansionist vision seemed unstoppable, and yet, the eastern neighbor, Stalin's Soviet Union, loomed as both a threat and a potential opportunity. Here, in the intricate dance of diplomacy and deception, the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would be signed as a non-aggression treaty that stunned the world. For Hitler, the pact was a temporary convenience. Ideologically, he loathed communism. His speeches, his writings, and his very worldview framed the Soviet Union as the ultimate nemesis of Europe, a monstrous amalgam of Bolshevism and Jewish conspiracy. Yet, strategically, Hitler was calculating. He knew that opening a second front while still consolidating control over Western Europe would be perilous. By signing a treaty with Stalin, he could secure his eastern flank, focus on Poland and France, and by the time he so desperately needed to prepare the Wehrmacht for the war he envisioned against the Soviet Union. But behind the diplomatic smiles, Hitler's hatred simmered. Every handshake, every signature, was a temporary pause in a war that he was already certain would come. Stalin, on the other hand, understood that this pact was not a peace treaty but a breathing space. The Soviet Union, still recovering from the devastating purges of the Red Army, which had eliminated many of its most experienced officers, was not yet ready to confront Hitler in full. Stalin's paranoia about internal enemies and foreign aggression made him keenly aware of the dangers of premature conflict. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact provided him with time to rebuild, reorganize, and prepare for the inevitable clash he suspected would erupt. But Stalin's agreement was not just defensive, it was opportunistic. Within weeks, the secret protocol of the pact would allow the Soviet Union to annex parts of Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania, expanding its territory while Hitler's armies prepared for war elsewhere. The early months of this uneasy arrangement reveal the striking psychological contrast between the two men. Hitler, burning with ideological hatred, could not suppress his contempt for the regime he was temporarily allied. Stalin, ever calculating, concealed his intentions beneath layers of diplomacy, deception, and bureaucratic patience. Hitler's worldview demanded immediate confrontation. Stalin's survival instinct dictated delay. This difference in mentality would echo throughout the ensuing conflict, shaping not only the strategies of war, but the lives of millions caught in the crossfire. Even as Germany and the Soviet Union publicly embraced a facade of cooperation, spies and intelligence networks operated feverishly. German military planners, still confident in their superiority, underestimated the capacity of the Soviet Union to rebuild and modernize in the short span provided by the pact. Meanwhile, Stalin ensured that the Red Army, though weakened by prior purges, was quietly rearming, retraining, and preparing for mechanized warfare on an industrial scale. Factories were relocated east of the Urals, rail networks expanded, and reserves stockpiled. All these measures were designed to survive the onslaught Hitler was already plotting in his mind. In the halls of Berlin and Moscow, the psychological dimensions of this temporary peace were palpable. Hitler, consumed by hatred for communism and the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy he imagined, could scarcely tolerate the idea of coexisting with Stalin, even briefly. Every diplomatic gesture was tainted by suspicion, every intelligence report interpreted as a potential threat. Stalin, in contrast, leveraged this animosity, understanding that Hitler's ideological rigidity would eventually compel him to act rashly. By exploiting the enemy's obsession, Stalin created a strategic advantage that was invisible to Hitler but would later prove decisive on the battlefields of the East. Meanwhile, in Poland and the Baltic states, the immediate consequences of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact unfolded brutally. German and Soviet forces partitioned the country, moving in tandem yet never fully trusting each other. Civilians experienced the violence of occupation, the destruction of communities, and the terror of two totalitarian regimes, each enforcing its own version of fear and control. Here, in the microcosm of these territories, the larger psychological struggle between Hitler and Stalin was reflected in the lives of ordinary people. The hatred of one and the calculated ruthlessness of the other converged to make these regions the first casualties of what would become the epic Eastern Front. The pact also shaped the initial military calculations for both nations. Hitler's generals recognized the operational advantages of a temporary alliance, using the pause to reorganize their forces for the eventual campaign against the Soviet Union. Stalin, however, was less concerned with the immediate political optics than with the long-term survival of the Soviet state. He analyzed every intelligence report, every movement of German troops, and every whisper from defectors or spies, absorbing information with a patience that would later frustrate the overconfident Wehrmacht. This period of quiet preparation belied the storm to come, a storm in which fear, hatred, and strategy would collide with devastating consequences. It is here, in the uneasy diplomacy of 1939 and 1940, that the psychological duel of Hitler versus Stalin began to take tangible shape. Hitler's obsessive focus on ideological conquest blinded him to the subtleties of strategy, while Stalin's calculated patience turned the same ideological obsession into a weapon of defensive and offensive advantage. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was more than a treaty. It was a chessboard, each move carefully calculated, each gesture hiding intentions that would later explode into full-scale war. By the time Hitler finally decided to break the agreement, launching Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the psychological landscape of the conflict was already established. Hitler's hatred of Stalin and fear of the Soviet system had festered unchecked for years, shaping plans that underestimated geography, climate, and human resilience. Stalin, anticipating eventual betrayal, had positioned his forces, reorganized his industry, and hardened his people to endure the worst. What seemed at first a simple arrangement of convenience had already set the stage for a confrontation in which strategy, psychology, and ideology would become inseparable. Even in these early stages, one can see why Hitler versus Stalin is more than a story of armies. It is a study of human psychology writ large, a demonstration of how fear and hatred influence decisions on a scale that can determine the fate of nations. Hitler's obsessive drive for ideological dominance ensured he would never wait for perfect conditions, while Stalin's cautious calculation meant that he could turn the enemy's impatience into a strategic advantage. These early dynamics, The interplay of mistrust, calculation, and ideological obsession formed the foundation upon which the epic battles of the Eastern Front would be fought. In the final analysis, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact serves as a chilling reminder. Wars are not only fought with weapons, but with perception, patience, and the ability to manipulate the fears of both allies and enemies. Hitler's ideological hatred for communism and Stalin's calculated pragmatism were already in motion, shaping the decisions, the mistakes, and the unexpected victories that would define one of the most devastating chapters in human history. And from this fragile, tension-laden period, the story of Hitler versus Stalin would explode into the largest invasion in human memory, where millions would fight, die, and endure under the shadow of two men whose obsessions dictated the fates of nations. By the summer of 1941, the tension that had been quietly simmering for years erupted into one of the largest military confrontations in human history, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler, whose obsession with the Soviet Union had grown with every year of diplomatic maneuvering, could no longer tolerate delay. The ideological enemy he had vilified in speeches and in print, Stalin, the Bolshevik, the architect of a system that Hitler believed threatened all of Europe, was about to face the full fury of the Third Reich. But as with so many of Hitler's campaigns, his calculations were marred by hubris, paranoia, and a belief in the invincibility of his own vision. At dawn on June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers crossed the borders of the Soviet Union along a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft moved in overwhelming force, supported by meticulously planned logistics that Hitler believed would guarantee swift victory. The Wehrmacht was confident. Many of Hitler's generals, however, harbored doubts. They recognized the vastness of the Soviet territory, the logistical nightmares of moving millions of men and tons of equipment across forests, rivers, and marshes, and the unpredictable resilience of the Red Army. Yet Hitler, consumed by fear of Stalin's potential preemptive strike and blinded by hatred of communism, dismissed these cautions. His ideology, rather than practical strategy, dictated the pace and scope of the invasion. The first weeks of Barbarossa were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Cities fell, armies were encircled, and millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in the maelstrom. Hitler's blitzkrieg tactics, honed in Poland and France, initially succeeded with devastating efficiency. Tanks rolled through villages, artillery leveled towns, and Luftwaffe planes reduced defensive positions to rubble. Yet beneath the surface of apparent German invincibility, cracks began to emerge, cracks that would be amplified by the psychological and strategic genius of Stalin. Stalin, though initially stunned by the speed and scale of the invasion, quickly began to assert control. The purges of the 1930s, which had decimated the officer corps, had left the Red Army vulnerable, but the Soviet system of political commissars and centralized authority enabled rapid mobilization and adaptation. Factories in the West were dismantled and shipped east, beyond the reach of German bombing. Entire populations were evacuated, food and resources stockpiled, and troops repositioned to prepare for counteroffensives. Stalin's resolve, often underestimated by German intelligence, became a force of attrition that would sap the momentum of the Wehrmacht over time. Hitler, meanwhile, continued to let ideology guide his decisions, a recurring error that history would punish. He divided his forces along multiple axes, focusing not on one decisive target, but on capturing symbolic cities and fulfilling racial and political objectives. Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev were all prioritized not only for their strategic value, but for what they represented in Hitler's worldview. This obsessive pursuit of symbolism over strategy slowed the German advance, stretched supply lines to breaking points, and exposed vulnerabilities that the Soviet Union was quick to exploit. The psychological dimension of Operation Barbarossa cannot be overstated. Hitler's fear of Stalin and the Soviet system led him to demand rapid victories, leaving little room for tactical patience. His hatred of communism drove him to underestimate the human cost and overestimate the willingness of his own troops to achieve ideological objectives at any expense. Stalin, conversely, used fear as a tool, maintaining strict discipline among his commanders, executing or purging those who faltered, and channeling collective dread into resilience. The contrast was stark. One leader's obsession produced reckless action, the other's paranoia produced adaptive strategy. One of the most illustrative examples of this clash is the Siege of Kiev, where over 500,000 Soviet troops were encircled and destroyed. While the Wehrmacht celebrated its tactical triumph, the time and resources expended contributed to delays that would later doom the German advance toward Moscow. Stalin, far from paralyzed by these losses, used them to reorganize his defenses, replace commanders, and implement scorched earth tactics that left nothing of value for the advancing Germans. The vastness of the Soviet Union, coupled with its population's endurance, would turn what appeared to be a fast, decisive campaign into a prolonged war of attrition that Hitler had not anticipated. As the Wehrmacht pressed eastward, environmental conditions further compounded the challenges. Summer heat gave way to mud, and eventually, the infamous Russian winter would arrive. But even before the cold set in, Hitler's logistical hubris was evident. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, vulnerable to partisan attacks and simple overextension. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and exhaustion among troops slowed the advance. Stalin's foresight in stockpiling resources and relocating critical infrastructure ensured that these weaknesses would be exploited, a testament to the Red Army's capacity to turn the enemy's fear-driven decisions into strategic advantage. The human cost of Barbarossa was staggering. Millions of civilians were caught between the hammer of the Wehrmacht and the anvil of Stalin's directives. Cities were bombarded, villages burned, and entire populations displaced. The ideological hatred that drove Hitler and the calculated ruthlessness of Stalin intersected in these tragic outcomes, illustrating how the personal obsessions of two men could manifest in mass suffering. Soldiers on both sides faced unimaginable conditions: starvation, frostbite, and the psychological toll of witnessing both comrades and enemies fall in brutal, often indiscriminate fashion. Yet, even amid these horrors, Stalin's resilience became increasingly apparent. Unlike Hitler, who often micromanaged his generals and demanded ideological conformity, the consequences of this psychological warfare would reverberate far beyond individual battles. Hitler's failure to balance ideology with strategic pragmatism, combined with his obsession with crushing Stalin, created opportunities for the Soviet Union to recover, reorganize, and ultimately counterattack. Stalin's use of fear and propaganda not only fortified his nation, but also manipulated the perceptions of the enemy, exploiting Hitler's paranoia and overreach to devastating effect. The human cost of these strategies, millions of soldiers dead, cities destroyed, civilians starving, was staggering. Yet from the perspective of the leaders, every loss was weighed against the larger objective: domination for Hitler's survival and ultimate victory for Stalin. In this sense, the war between Hitler and Stalin was as much a battle of minds as it was of armies. Operation Barbarossa, while a physical campaign, was also a crucible in which ideology, paranoia, and psychological strategy collided. Hitler's fear of Stalin's potential, his hatred of communism, and his obsession with rapid conquest dictated decisions that often undermined his own objectives. Stalin's ability to harness fear, manipulate perception, and maintain control over a fragile yet resilient state allowed him to turn disaster into opportunity, attrition into advantage, and human endurance into strategic leverage. By the time the Wehrmacht's advance began to slow near Moscow, The Eastern Front had become more than a theater of physical warfare. It was a landscape defined by fear, propaganda, ideology, and psychological resilience. The dueling strategies of Hitler and Stalin demonstrated that wars are not won by firepower alone. They are won by perception, by discipline, and by the capacity to exploit the weaknesses of an obsessive, paranoid adversary. The lessons of psychological warfare, embedded in every siege, battle, and campaign, would continue to influence the trajectory of the conflict and ultimately determine the outcome of one of history's deadliest wars. Operation Barbarossa revealed that the clash between Hitler and Stalin was not simply a confrontation of armies, but a confrontation of minds. Ideology versus pragmatism, hatred versus calculated ruthlessness, obsession versus endurance. The Eastern Front became the arena in which these psychological forces were tested, measured, and ultimately decisive. Every decision, from the macro-level planning of campaigns to the micro-level control of civilians, bore the imprint of this mental duel. The consequences were catastrophic, the stakes unparalleled, and the lessons enduring. As the Eastern Front stretched across thousands of miles of forests, plains, and rivers, the abstract conflict between Hitler and Stalin took on an unbearably human dimension. The war that had begun as an ideological obsession and calculated strategy now manifested in suffering measured not in political terms, but in starvation, frostbite, disease, and death. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Families were torn apart. Soldiers faced the relentless machinery of modern warfare under conditions that tested every limit of human endurance. The early battles of the Eastern Front were not simply military engagements. They were theaters of extreme human vulnerability. From the outskirts of Leningrad to the approaches of Moscow, German advances inflicted enormous casualties, but the cost was mutual. Hitler's initial successes came at a price he did not fully account for: overextended supply lines, exhausted troops, and the unpredictable resilience of the Red Army. Stalin's forces, though initially disorganized by purges and logistical challenges, absorbed losses with a discipline honed by decades of fear and survival, transforming catastrophe into a foundation for counteraction. Consider the siege of Leningrad, a city of over 2 million civilians. Encircled by German forces in 1941, the city became a prison, its inhabitants subjected to starvation, bombardment, and freezing winters. Hitler's strategy, guided by ideological hatred and the desire to break Soviet morale, aimed to reduce the city to submission. Yet Stalin's insistence on holding Leningrad, combined with propaganda portraying the city as a symbol of Soviet endurance, turned this siege into a crucible of human resilience. Civilians endured months without adequate food, water, or heat. Children froze in the streets. Starvation reached catastrophic levels. Yet in their suffering, they became instruments of a larger strategic and psychological objective: to demonstrate the unbreakable resolve of the Soviet people. Meanwhile, on the open plains of Ukraine and Belarus, early German advances created encirclements of staggering scale. Millions of Soviet soldiers were surrounded, and while many were killed or captured, the Soviet command structure adapted rapidly. Stalin's willingness to replace commanders, reorganize units, and implement strategic withdrawals reflected a leadership style that transformed human loss into operational learning. Hitler, by contrast, often interpreted these setbacks as personal affronts or ideological failures, micromanaging decisions, and pursuing revenge rather than adjusting strategy. The result was a cascade of errors that compounded the human toll. The winter of 1941 to 1942 introduced another layer of human suffering. Soldiers from both sides endured temperatures far below freezing, often without adequate clothing or supplies. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exposure killed tens of thousands before bullets were even fired. Hitler, convinced that Soviet weakness would lead to a rapid collapse, had failed to prepare the Wehrmacht for such extreme conditions. Stalin, in contrast, anticipated the brutal Russian winter. Troops were equipped and trained to survive, supply lines fortified, and the vast geography was used strategically to slow and exhaust the enemy. This environmental factor magnified the consequences of leadership decisions and ideological obsession, turning geography itself into an ally of Soviet resilience. Civilians, caught between advancing and retreating armies, bore the brunt of the human cost. Forced evacuations, mass executions, and reprisals for partisan activity turned villages and towns into landscapes of horror. Food shortages and the destruction of infrastructure amplified suffering. Every German atrocity, often motivated by ideological hatred, fed into Stalin's propaganda narratives, reinforcing the perception of Hitler as a monstrous aggressor. Conversely, the Red Army's strict discipline and the moral framing of resistance under Stalin's guidance aimed to channel civilian suffering into strategic advantage, ensuring that even in despair, populations contributed to the war effort. Battles such as Smolensk, Kiev, and Vyazma illustrate the interplay of human endurance and strategic miscalculation. Hitler's obsession with rapid conquest led to the overextension of forces, creating encirclements and leaving gaps that Soviet commanders exploited. Stalin's insistence on centralized control, combined with decentralized adaptability in local engagements, allowed Soviet forces to recover from near disasters, counterattack, and maintain the integrity of the front. Each human loss, each fallen soldier, became part of a larger calculus in which fear, survival, and resilience determined not only immediate outcomes, but the long-term capacity to endure a war of attrition. The German army's operational errors, influenced by ideological obsession, had direct consequences for human life. Orders to execute civilians suspected of collaboration. The early human cost also underscores a larger truth about Hitler versus Stalin. Wars are as much about perception and morale as they are about weapons and tactics. Soldiers fought not only because of duty, but because of the narratives imposed by leadership. German troops, indoctrinated to believe they were fighting a crusade against Bolshevism, often acted with cruelty and determination, yet this ideological zeal sometimes led to fatal overreach. Soviet troops, instilled with fear of both the enemy and their own command, endured unimaginable hardship, but their resilience was reinforced by propaganda and strict discipline, turning fear into a strategic advantage. By the end of 1941, the early battles of the Eastern Front had demonstrated the limitations of ideological obsession and the power of pragmatic ruthlessness. Hitler's initial victories were Pyrrhic, fought at staggering human cost, and failing to achieve decisive results. Stalin's ability to absorb losses, maintain morale, and strategically retreat or counterattack laid the groundwork for the Red Army's eventual resurgence. The human cost was incalculable, yet within that suffering lay the seeds of Soviet endurance and eventual victory. Every frostbitten soldier, every starving civilian, and every obliterated city bore witness to the consequences of fear, hatred, and strategic miscalculation. Hitler's obsession blinded him to these human realities, while Stalin's cold pragmatism allowed him to harness them for survival and eventual triumph. The early battles of the Eastern Front, therefore, were not only about territory or tanks. They were about endurance, perception, and the psychological duel that defined the war between two of history's most infamous leaders. In the broader scope, the early human cost set the stage for what would follow: prolonged sieges, massive offensives, and a war in which the interplay of psychology, ideology, and survival would determine the fate of nations. Hitler versus Stalin was no longer a theoretical clash of ideas or a contest of generals. It was a human tragedy, a massive experiment in endurance, and a prelude to the decisive turning points that would eventually reshape the Eastern Front. By late 1942, the Eastern Front had already claimed millions of lives. Yet the true nature of Hitler versus Stalin, the clash of obsession and pragmatism, was poised to reveal itself in stark, decisive form. The early momentum of Operation Barbarossa had slowed. The harsh Russian winters had tested the limits of German endurance, and the Red Army, battered but unbroken, had begun to regroup, reorganize, and prepare for the pivotal moments that would define the course of the war. One of the most consequential turning points came at Stalingrad. The city, situated on the banks of the Volga River, was more than a strategic objective, it was a symbol. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would not only secure vital oil fields in the Caucasus, but also strike a psychological blow to the Soviet Union, demonstrating the superiority of the Third Reich and crushing Stalin's prestige. For Stalin, the defense of Stalingrad was equally symbolic, a test of Soviet resilience, a statement that the Red Army could absorb losses, endure suffering, and emerge stronger. The confrontation in Stalingrad would crystallize the contrast between Hitler's fear-driven overreach and Stalin's calculated endurance. Hitler's approach to the battle was emblematic of his broader strategic flaws. Obsessed with ideology and personal vengeance, he committed enormous resources to urban combat, demanding advances even when logistics faltered and conditions deteriorated. German soldiers were stretched thin, supply lines overextended, and morale strained by the brutal reality of house-to-house fighting in a city reduced to rubble. Hitler's obsession with taking the city, named after Stalin, became a personal vendetta, blinding him to operational necessities and exposing the Wehrmacht to attrition in a way that would prove catastrophic. Stalin, in contrast, balanced ruthlessness with pragmatism. He ordered that Stalingrad be defended at all costs, but he also orchestrated a strategic depth that allowed the Red Army to rotate troops, reinforce positions, and exploit weaknesses in German logistics. The Soviet command used intelligence, counteroffensives, and psychological resilience to absorb the German assault. Civilians, already traumatized by years of occupation, bombardment, and displacement, were mobilized into labor battalions, building fortifications, clearing rubble, and maintaining morale. The city itself became a weapon, a landscape that magnified German errors and leveraged Soviet endurance. The encirclement of German forces during the winter of 1942 to 1943 marked a profound turning point. Hitler, overconfident in the invincibility of his army and driven by fear of losing face, refused to authorize retreat, insisting that the Sixth Army hold its positions despite deteriorating conditions. Stalin, conversely, waited with calculated patience, allowing the Germans to exhaust themselves before launching a decisive counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. Encircled and starving, German soldiers faced the devastating consequences of their leader's obsession and ideological rigidity. The fall of Stalingrad would mark the first major defeat for Hitler on the Eastern Front and a shift in the psychological momentum of the war. Simultaneously, other theaters along the Eastern Front were undergoing transformations that underscored the importance of strategy over obsession. In the Caucasus, German advances were stalled by overextension and logistical nightmares, while Soviet counteroffensives exploited gaps created by Hitler's micromanagement. In Kharkov, Rostov, and the Donetsk Basin, the Red Army, learning from previous defeats, executed tactical retreats followed by counterattacks, demonstrating a capacity to absorb loss, reorganize, and strike decisively. Each engagement, each maneuver, reflected the fundamental difference between Hitler's fear-driven aggression and Stalin's strategic patience. The Battle of Stalingrad also revealed the psychological dimensions of these turning points. German soldiers, indoctrinated to believe they were invincible, faced the stark reality of their vulnerability. Morale plummeted under relentless winter conditions, urban combat, and the realization that Hitler's obsession with ideological victory outweighed practical survival. Soviet forces, conversely, drew strength from propaganda, discipline, and the belief that they were defending not only a city but the survival of their nation. Fear became a tool for Stalin and a weapon against Hitler, turning human psychology into a decisive element of the conflict. Stalingrad's aftermath had reverberations across the Eastern Front. Hitler's hubris, evident in his refusal to heed generals' advice and adapt strategy, led to cascading failures elsewhere. Supply lines stretched to breaking points, secondary objectives were abandoned or captured poorly, and German forces began a slow, costly retreat that highlighted the limits of ideology-driven warfare. Stalin's resilience, in contrast, set the stage for a sequence of Soviet offensives that would reclaim territory, weaken German positions, and shift the balance of power along the Eastern Front. The larger strategic implications of these turning points cannot be overstated. Hitler's obsession with symbolic victories, his hatred of communism, and his fear of Stalin's potential overreach led him to overcommit, micromanage, and prioritize vengeance over operational logic. Stalin's patience, ruthlessness, and ability to absorb losses allowed him to exploit these errors, creating a momentum that transformed the war from one of German expansion to one of Soviet. Beyond the immediate military consequences, these turning points also had profound psychological and societal effects. Civilians in occupied territories saw hope return as the Red Army gained momentum, while German populations, initially buoyed by propaganda of swift victories, confronted the reality of protracted and costly warfare. The attritional nature of the conflict, combined with the staggering human cost of battles like Stalingrad, highlighted the interplay between leadership psychology and the endurance of societies under extreme stress. Hitler's failure to reconcile ideology with logistics contrasted sharply with Stalin's ability to channel fear, loss, and human suffering into national resilience and strategic advantage. As the winter of 1942 to 1943 ended, the Eastern Front had irreversibly changed. Stalingrad was not merely a battle. It was a crucible in which the psychological, ideological, and strategic differences between Hitler and Stalin were tested and made manifest. Hitler's obsession had driven his forces into a trap of his own making, while Stalin's calculated ruthlessness had preserved the Red Army and strengthened the Soviet position. The turning points of this period demonstrated that victory on the Eastern Front was as much about leadership psychology, adaptability, and endurance as it was about manpower or firepower. Operation Barbarossa's initial promise of rapid conquest had evolved into a grinding war of attrition, with Hitler increasingly reactive and Stalin increasingly proactive. The human cost was staggering, yet it was within this crucible of suffering, fear, and endurance that the Red Army learned, adapted, and positioned itself for the decisive offensives that would eventually roll back the Third Reich. Every lost city, every frostbitten soldier, and every shattered community contributed to the strategic calculus that defined the shifting balance of power. These turning points also set the psychological stage for subsequent campaigns along the Eastern Front. Hitler's obsession and paranoia would continue to dictate strategic errors, while Stalin's patience, ruthlessness, and psychological manipulation of both enemy and ally would create cumulative advantages. The war, once a rapid march of conquest, had become a complex interplay of human resilience, ideological fanaticism, and strategic foresight. The Eastern Front was no longer merely a battlefield. It was a testament to the consequences of leadership, obsession, and adaptability. In the end, the battles of Stalingrad and other turning points of late 1942 were more than military engagements. They were tests of human endurance, psychological fortitude, and strategic insight. Hitler's fear-driven decisions and ideological rigidity clashed with Stalin's calculated ruthlessness, producing outcomes that would shape the trajectory of the war for years to come. The Eastern Front had shifted from German initiative to Soviet momentum, setting the stage for a series of counteroffensives that would ultimately determine the fate of millions and redefine the power balance in Europe. By 1943, the Eastern Front had become a vast, grinding theater of destruction, where ideology and obsession clashed with pragmatism and endurance. Hitler's initial lightning advances, fueled by fear of Stalin and hatred of communism, had slowed and faltered. The early momentum of Operation Barbarossa was gone, replaced by exhaustion, overextended supply lines, and the staggering human cost of battles like Stalingrad. The contrast between the two leaders, Hitler's hubris and Stalin's strategic patience, had never been more apparent. Hitler's hubris was evident in every decision he made. Rather than delegating operational control to experienced generals, he increasingly micromanaged campaigns, overriding military advice in favor of ideological objectives. Tactical considerations were subordinated to personal vendettas, symbolic victories, and the obsessive desire to crush Stalin personally and communism ideologically. Every setback, every failed encirclement, and every logistical bottleneck was interpreted not as a flaw in planning, but as a reflection of his generals' loyalty or competence. This inflexibility would exact an enormous toll on the Wehrmacht, draining manpower, morale, and resources in a war that was becoming as much about survival as conquest. Meanwhile, Stalin's strategy was the antithesis of Hitler's impulsive obsession. Where Hitler imposed ideology on the battlefield, Stalin allowed strategy to guide operations, even when ruthless measures were required. Stalin understood the value of patience, waiting for the enemy to overextend, to exhaust his forces, and to reveal weaknesses. He used intelligence, partisan activity, and operational depth to create opportunities for counteroffensives. Whereas Hitler's decisions were reactive, fear-driven, and often symbolic, Stalin's were deliberate, calculated, and adaptive, producing results that would ultimately turn the tide of the Eastern Front. The contrast between these leadership styles became apparent in multiple campaigns. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler refused to authorize strategic retreats or reprioritize objectives, insisting that German troops hold untenable positions across vast, frozen landscapes. His obsession with symbolism and vengeance, cities named after Stalin, and territories representing ideological or racial conquests led to unnecessary human suffering and operational failure. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, starvation, and relentless Soviet attacks, often without relief or strategic purpose. Hitler's obsession blinded him to the most basic principles of logistics, forcing German forces into a reactive stance where every decision was shaped by fear, pride, and ideological rigidity. Stalin, conversely, had absorbed the lessons of early losses and purges. His ruthlessness was tempered by pragmatism, allowing him to rotate troops, reinforce critical sectors, and concentrate forces at decisive points. He recognized that survival, not ideology, was the immediate objective. The Red Army's resilience was rooted in this strategic clarity: absorb the initial blows, reorganize, and strike decisively when conditions were favorable. The stark difference between Hitler's fear-driven aggression and Stalin's patient ruthlessness was most apparent in the winter campaigns of 1943, where Soviet counteroffensives exploited German overreach and logistical weakness. The contrast was also psychological. Hitler's obsession with Stalin and communism instilled fear within his own command structure. Generals hesitated to contradict him, aware that disobedience or counsel perceived as disloyal could result in execution or demotion. Stalin's fear, in contrast, was instrumentally applied. While purges and discipline created an environment of obedience, They also ensured that those in command understood their responsibilities and executed them with precision. Fear became a tool for the effective administration of war, rather than a blinding force that led to self-destructive overreach. The strategic consequences of this contrast manifested across multiple theaters. In the Kursk salient, for example, Hitler's obsession with launching an ambitious offensive underestimated Soviet preparation, intelligence, and depth of defense. Stalin's patience and strategic foresight allowed the Red Army to anticipate the German attack, fortify positions, and then launch a decisive counteroffensive that inflicted massive German losses. Where Hitler's ideology-driven hubris led to operational overreach, Stalin's strategic calculation converted preparation, endurance, and foresight into battlefield dominance. By 1943, the Eastern Front had transformed into a narrative of opposing leadership philosophies. Hitler's obsession, paranoia, and ideological rigidity created vulnerability, amplified human suffering, and eroded the Wehrmacht's effectiveness. Stalin's ruthless pragmatism, patient strategy, and capacity to convert fear into resilience turned adversity into advantage, gradually reshaping the balance of power. Every city retaken, every German offensive blunted, and every Red Army counterstrike demonstrated the superiority of calculated leadership over obsessive ideology. Even in retreat, Hitler's forces continued to suffer from the consequences of hubris. Overextended supply lines, exhausted soldiers, and the psychological strain of repeated setbacks left the Wehrmacht vulnerable to Soviet offensives. Stalin's methodical approach ensured that losses were strategically absorbed, troops were rotated and reinforced, and counterattacks were launched with precision. The cumulative effect of these differences would eventually push German forces westward, city by city, kilometer by kilometer, reversing the gains achieved in the early months of Barbarossa. Hitler versus Stalin, at this stage, was no longer a contest of ideology versus ideology, but a study in leadership psychology. The Eastern Front illustrated that obsession and hatred, unchecked by pragmatism or strategic reasoning, could bring initial victories but ultimately lead to catastrophic losses. Conversely, ruthlessness combined with calculated patience, disciplined command, and the ability to exploit the opponent's flaws could convert adversity into advantage and human suffering into strategic leverage. The fates of millions of soldiers and civilians alike were being dictated by these contrasting approaches to command, fear, and decision-making. The long-term lesson of this period is clear: leadership, vision, and the psychological application of power can determine outcomes as decisively as numerical superiority or technological advantage. Hitler's hubris, driven by fear, obsession, and ideological zeal, had created vulnerabilities that Stalin, with patience, ruthlessness, and strategic acumen, was systematically exploiting. By mid-1943, the Eastern Front had shifted from German initiative to Soviet momentum, and the course of World War II was increasingly shaped by the enduring contrast between the obsessions of Hitler and the calculated ruthlessness of Stalin. Still in 1943, the Eastern Front had become a relentless arena of destruction, where the limits of human endurance collided with the obsessions of two leaders. Hitler's hubris, ideological rigidity, and obsessive fear of Stalin had left the Wehrmacht overextended, exhausted, and increasingly vulnerable. Every miscalculation, every symbolic obsession, and every refusal to retreat had weakened German positions and magnified the effectiveness of Stalin's strategic patience. The fall of the Eastern Front was not a single battle or moment, but a cascading series of events, shaped as much by leadership psychology as by firepower, that would irreversibly tilt the balance of the war. The retreat from the Kursk salient exemplified the consequences of Hitler's strategic failures. After the failed offensive at Kursk, German forces were forced to withdraw, abandoning both territory and morale. The meticulous Soviet defenses, combined with Stalin's ability to anticipate and exploit German overreach, had inflicted devastating losses. Hitler, consumed by fear of losing face and ideological defeat, continued to demand symbolic victories even in the face of logistical collapse. German soldiers were compelled to fight defensive battles under extreme conditions, often without sufficient reinforcements or supplies. Each retreat, rather than restoring stability, exposed vulnerabilities that the Red Army exploited, accelerating the German collapse. Stalin's counteroffensives were the embodiment of calculated ruthlessness. Unlike Hitler, he did not pursue symbolic gestures or personal vendettas. Every movement, every strike, every redeployment was measured to maximize strategic gain while minimizing unnecessary loss of critical resources. The Red Army, strengthened by lessons learned in early battles and informed by intelligence and partisan reports, advanced methodically, reclaiming towns, cities, and territory while preserving cohesion and morale. The Soviet approach transformed the Eastern Front from a theater of attritional stalemates into a corridor of strategic momentum that German forces could not reverse. The human dimension of this collapse was immense. German soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, faced relentless Soviet pressure as they retreated westward. Frostbite, starvation, and the psychological strain of constant counterattacks decimated units. Civilians in occupied territories, who had endured years of terror and exploitation, often aided Soviet advances, further undermining German positions. Hitler's ideological obsession with maintaining control and punishing traitors in both occupied lands and the military hierarchy compounded the Wehrmacht's difficulties. Each decision made in fear or hubris magnified the physical and psychological toll of retreat, illustrating the lethal consequences of obsession on the battlefield. Cities along the Eastern Front, Kharkov, Smolensk, Kiev, and eventually Warsaw, fell back into Soviet hands, often with minimal German resistance. Hitler's insistence on holding positions at all costs had left German units isolated and vulnerable to encirclement. Stalin, however, had orchestrated these victories through precise operational planning, ensuring that Soviet advances were supported by reserves, supply lines, and coordinated artillery and armor. The contrast between a leadership style driven by fear and obsession versus one guided by calculation and pragmatism had never been clearer. Where Hitler's decisions produced chaos and vulnerability, Stalin's produced opportunity and momentum. The collapse of the Eastern Front also highlighted the logistical genius embedded in Stalin's strategy. German advances had initially outrun supply lines. By mid-1944, the cumulative effect of these strategies was undeniable. German forces were no longer capable of sustained offensive action. Cities, fortresses, and supply depots were falling, and morale among troops and civilians alike had plummeted. Hitler's obsession with ideology, vengeance, and symbolic victory had left him incapable of responding effectively to the operational realities imposed by Stalin's calculated strategy. The Eastern Front, once the stage for rapid German conquest, had transformed into a corridor of Soviet dominance, a testament to endurance, planning, and ruthless pragmatism. The human cost during this period was staggering. Millions of soldiers from both sides had perished, countless civilians were displaced, and entire cities lay in ruins. Yet within this devastation lay a narrative of survival, adaptation, and strategic clarity. Hitler's focus on personal and ideological obsession had blinded him to logistics, terrain, and human endurance, while Stalin's strategic patience and ruthlessness allowed the Soviet Union to absorb initial disasters, regroup, and systematically exploit German weaknesses. The contrast was stark: obsession and ideology versus calculated ruthlessness and pragmatism. Even as German forces retreated, Hitler's psychological grip continued to affect operations. Orders were issued that prioritized symbolism over practicality, forcing troops to defend untenable positions and pursue unrealistic objectives. Stalin, however, leveraged these rigidities, creating opportunities for encirclement, liberation, and strategic advantage. The fall of the Eastern Front was thus not merely a military collapse, but a demonstration of how leadership psychology, decision-making, and the ability to exploit an obsessive adversary could determine the fate of millions. The Eastern Front's transformation also set the stage for subsequent Soviet advances into Eastern Europe. The German retreat created momentum that the Red Army would carry westward, liberating territories and establishing conditions that would shape post-war Europe. Hitler's failure to reconcile ideology with strategy ensured that every German setback reinforced Soviet progress. Stalin's ability to integrate operational, psychological, and strategic dimensions of warfare ensured that the collapse was decisive, systematic, and irreversible. By the end of 1944, the fall of the Eastern Front had become emblematic of the overarching dynamic between Hitler and Stalin. Hitler's obsession, fear, and ideological rigidity had led to strategic overreach, while Stalin's calculated ruthlessness and patience transformed adversity into opportunity. German forces, once seemingly invincible, were pushed back continuously, and the narrative of the Eastern Front shifted irreversibly in favor of the Soviet Union. The consequences of these contrasting approaches on soldiers, civilians, and the trajectory of the war would be studied for decades as a testament to the interplay between psychology, leadership, and strategy in shaping history. By 1945, the Eastern Front had become a testament not only to the scale of human suffering, but also to the profound impact of leadership psychology, strategy, and ideology. Hitler versus Stalin was no longer a simple confrontation of armies. It had evolved into a clash of philosophies, fear-driven obsession against calculated ruthlessness, ideology against pragmatism. The strategic legacy of this conflict extended far beyond the battlefield, reshaping the geopolitical, military, and psychological understanding of leadership in modern warfare. Hitler's downfall, particularly on the Eastern Front, was as much a product of his personal obsessions as it was of battlefield circumstances. From the outset of Operation Barbarossa, his decisions were guided less by operational logic and more by ideological imperatives and personal vendettas. Each symbolic objective, whether a city named after Stalin, a strategic railway hub, or an industrial center, became a fixation that diverted resources, overextended forces, and magnified human suffering. His inability to reconcile ideology with strategy meant that victories, however initially spectacular, were often Pyrrhic. Every tactical error compounded, ultimately eroding the operational capacity of the Wehrmacht and sealing the fate of the Third Reich. Stalin's strategic legacy, in contrast, was rooted in his capacity to integrate ruthlessness with patience. Unlike Hitler, he was willing to absorb initial setbacks, reorganize shattered units, and transform human and material loss into operational advantage. The Red Army's resilience on the Eastern Front was not accidental. It was the product of careful planning, strict discipline, and an unyielding willingness to leverage both human and environmental factors to achieve strategic objectives. Stalin's approach demonstrated that endurance, pragmatism, and the systematic exploitation of enemy weakness could overcome even the most ideologically motivated and initially dominant adversary. The long-term implications of this contrast are profound. Hitler's obsession with ideology over logic left the German military vulnerable to cumulative mistakes. Every failed offensive, every overextended supply line, and every symbolic obsession contributed to a chain of setbacks that the Soviets would exploit. Stalin's ability to translate human endurance, strategic patience, and psychological insight into military advantage not only turned the tide of the Eastern Front, but reshaped the post-war balance of power in Europe. The Soviet Union emerged from this conflict with both strategic and political leverage, setting the stage for its dominant role in the emerging Cold War. Beyond the operational and geopolitical impact, the strategic legacy of Hitler versus Stalin provides insight into the interplay between leadership psychology and war outcomes. Hitler's fear of Stalin, combined with his obsessive hatred of communism, dictated decisions that were often irrational, reactive, and catastrophic. Stalin's calculated ruthlessness, tempered by patience and operational foresight, allowed him to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities to devastating effect. The Eastern Front illustrates that wars are won as much in the minds of leaders as on the battlefield itself. The mental frameworks, obsessions, and fears of commanders can shape the fate of nations just as decisively as tanks, artillery, or manpower. One of the most enduring lessons of this strategic legacy is the role of adaptability. Hitler's rigidity, his insistence on maintaining symbolic objectives at all costs, and his micromanagement of operational details left him blind to shifting realities. He failed to recognize the cumulative effect of attrition. Moreover, this legacy underscores the importance of psychological warfare and propaganda in shaping operational outcomes. Hitler's demonization of Stalin and communism drove excessive cruelty, while Stalin's portrayal of Hitler as an existential threat galvanized resistance, mobilized populations, and reinforced military cohesion. The manipulation of perception, morale, and fear was not ancillary but central to the strategic outcomes of the Eastern Front. The interplay of ideology, psychology, and operational art became a decisive factor, ensuring that human perception and endurance were as important as tanks, planes, or artillery. From a leadership perspective, Hitler versus Stalin serves as a study in the consequences of obsession versus calculated ruthlessness. Hitler's obsession led to overreach, micromanagement, and catastrophic strategic errors. Stalin's pragmatism, patience, and ruthlessness transformed setbacks into victories and adversity into strategic leverage. This contrast offers lessons for military historians, political theorists, and leaders across disciplines. Ideology without pragmatism can blind even the most formidable power, while strategic patience and calculated ruthlessness can turn initial weakness into decisive advantage. The Eastern Front also revealed the role of timing and momentum in strategic outcomes. Stalin's patience allowed him to wait for opportune moments, such as during the winter counteroffensives or the encirclement operations after Kursk, to deliver maximum impact. Hitler's impatience and obsession, by contrast, forced premature offensives and symbolic actions that created vulnerabilities. The war demonstrates that momentum is not merely a function of resources, but of leadership psychology, strategic timing, and the capacity to exploit the adversary's weaknesses. Ultimately, the strategic legacy of Hitler versus Stalin is a multidimensional lesson in the intersection of ideology, psychology, and operational art. Hitler's downfall on the Eastern Front was shaped not solely by numbers or material, but by his own obsessions, fears, and rigid ideology. Stalin's endurance, ruthlessness, and strategic insight transformed the Red Army into a decisive force capable of reclaiming lost territory, inflicting catastrophic losses on the Wehrmacht, and shaping the post-war geopolitical landscape. The Eastern Front, in this sense, was more than a battlefield. It was a proving ground for leadership, strategy, and the human capacity to endure, adapt, and prevail. As the guns fell silent on the Eastern Front, and the wreckage of cities, armies, and empires lay scattered across Europe, one truth became unmistakable. The war between Hitler and Stalin was as much a contest of minds as it was a battle of armies. The story of Hitler versus Stalin is not merely about troop movements, tanks, or artillery. It is a profound exploration of leadership, obsession, psychology, and the human capacity to endure and adapt under the most extreme conditions. It is a narrative that transcends dates and statistics, delving into the philosophy of power, fear, and resilience. Hitler, throughout his campaign against the Soviet Union, was driven by an unrelenting ideology and a personal vendetta. His fear of Stalin, combined with obsessive hatred of communism, dictated every operational decision. Battles were not only military engagements, but symbolic confrontations, intended to crush the Soviet spirit as much as the Red Army. Every strategic error, from the overextension of supply lines to the insistence on holding untenable cities, was magnified by his ideological rigidity. Hitler's downfall was therefore as much internal as it was external. The obsessions and fears that fueled his ambition also blinded him to the realities of war, ensuring that tactical victories could not translate into strategic success. Stalin's approach, in contrast, was rooted in calculated pragmatism and ruthless patience. He absorbed setbacks, reorganized shattered units, and used human suffering as a tool to achieve strategic advantage. Stalin understood that wars were won not by ideology alone, but by the ability to manipulate, endure, and exploit both terrain and human psychology. The Red Army's resilience was a testament to this philosophy. Losses, attrition, and hardship were incorporated into broader strategic designs, transforming adversity into opportunity and fear into discipline. The contrast between Hitler's obsession-driven command and Stalin's calculated ruthlessness underscores a fundamental lesson in leadership. Survival and victory are inseparable from the capacity to think strategically and manage human and material resources with clarity and foresight. The human cost of this confrontation cannot be overstated. Millions of soldiers perished, countless civilians were displaced, and entire cities were reduced to rubble. Yet embedded within this devastation are stories of endurance, courage, and the ability of ordinary individuals to survive, adapt, and continue fighting despite overwhelming odds. The Eastern Front was more than a military theater. It was a crucible that tested the limits of human resilience, exposing both the destructive potential of obsession and the transformative power of strategic patience. Hitler's obsession amplified suffering, while Stalin's ruthlessness, tempered by calculation, harnessed it toward defined objectives. Beyond the immediate human and material costs, the philosophical lessons of the Eastern Front extend into the broader study of history and leadership. Hitler's obsessive fixation on ideology, vengeance, and personal vendettas illustrates the dangers of allowing emotion and fear to dominate decision-making. Stalin's endurance and strategic patience demonstrate how calculated ruthlessness, discipline, and adaptability can turn adversity into advantage. The conflict on the Eastern Front becomes a case study in the consequences of leadership psychology, revealing that the mental frameworks of commanders' obsession, fear, patience, and pragmatism can determine the fate of nations as decisively as technology, manpower, or terrain. The interplay of fear and hatred was central to the trajectory of Hitler versus Stalin. Hitler's fear of Stalin and hatred of communism led to micromanagement, unrealistic strategic goals, and catastrophic operational decisions. Stalin, by contrast, harnessed fear as an instrument, both to enforce discipline within the Red Army and to exploit vulnerabilities in the enemy. This psychological dimension shaped not only individual battles, but the course of entire campaigns, proving that warfare is as much a contest of perception, morale, and resilience as it is of firepower or numbers. The Eastern Front also demonstrated the consequences of leadership obsession on strategic outcomes. Hitler's insistence on symbolic objectives, refusal to adapt strategy, and ideological rigidity amplified losses, and in the end, the Eastern Front was not merely a battlefield of soldiers, but a theater of human emotion, ideology, and psychological conflict. The obsessions of Hitler, the ruthlessness of Stalin, and the endurance of ordinary people intersected in a narrative that reshaped nations and redefined the parameters of modern warfare. It was a war fought as much in minds as on soil, as much in ideology as in artillery. Every city burned, every life lost, and every strategic maneuver was part of a larger story of fear, hatred, resilience, and the exercise of will. The story of Hitler versus Stalin ultimately teaches that leadership cannot be measured solely in victories or losses, but in the capacity to balance emotion, ideology, and strategy. Obsession, fear, and hatred can yield temporary success, but they also sow the seeds of collapse. Patience, calculation, and ruthless pragmatism can endure adversity and turn temporary setbacks into decisive victories. The Eastern Front, in its vast scale and human cost, stands as the most vivid illustration of this principle. As we reflect on these events, the lessons resonate far beyond the historical moment. Leadership, strategy, psychology, and human resilience are eternally intertwined. Hitler versus Stalin is not only a history of military confrontation, it is a study of the human condition, a meditation on the consequences of obsession, and a testament to the enduring power of calculated will. In this crucible of fire and blood, the destinies of millions were determined, not just by weapons or numbers, but by the minds, fears, and strategies of two men, Hitler and Stalin. The Eastern Front reminds us that the greatest battles are often fought not with guns, but with the human mind. Hatred can drive nations to destruction. Fear can paralyze even the mightiest armies. Patience and calculated resilience can transform adversity into triumph. Hitler versus Stalin was a war of ideology and obsession against pragmatism and endurance, a confrontation that ultimately demonstrated that leadership, psychology, and strategic foresight can determine the fate of the world itself. This is the history of the Eastern Front, a history written not only in blood but in the lessons of fear, hatred, and the endurance of will.